The story of Adam and Eve is one of the most well-known narratives in history. For centuries, people have believed that Cain was Eve's first child, the beginning of humanity's long and troubled journey on Earth. But what if that is not the entire story? What if ancient texts and forgotten traditions point to the existence of another child, one erased from history long before Cain and Abel became central figures? This possibility shakes the foundations of what we think we know about the origins of mankind and opens the door to one of the Bible's greatest mysteries. When we read Genesis, we see a simple sequence. Adam and Eve are created, placed in the Garden of Eden, fall into sin, and are expelled. Soon after, the text introduces the birth of Cain and then Abel. Yet the Bible is surprisingly silent about the details of Eve's pregnancies or whether there were children before Cain. Some scholars have long pointed out that these gaps may hide information that was once known to the early Hebrews but was later lost or deliberately removed. Could it be that Eve bore a child before Cain, a child whose identity and story were buried in time? Ancient Jewish writings such as the Targum and the Book of Jubilees contain intriguing hints. They suggest that the early chapters of Genesis were far more complex than the version we have today. These texts occasionally allude to multiple births and to events that occurred before the story of Cain and Abel. While these writings are not part of the biblical canon, they preserve traditions that circulated among early believers and rabbis. Such references lead us to question whether our current version of Genesis omits details that might completely change our understanding of humanity's first family. The Hebrew language itself provides clues. In the original text, the verbs used for conception and birth in Genesis 4:1 have unusual forms that may imply that Eve had conceived before the event being described. Some scholars even interpret this as an indirect reference to another child, one who may not have been officially acknowledged or recorded. This theory is further fueled by ancient interpretations that questioned Cain's true paternity, suggesting that something mysterious happened in Eden long before humanity's first murder took place. If there was indeed a child before Cain, the implications are profound. This child could represent a forgotten bloodline, one that never made its way into the final version of Genesis. Such an omission might have been intentional, either to protect a truth considered too controversial or to fit a theological framework established centuries later. The existence of a pre-Cain child would radically alter the way we see humanity's origins, raising questions about inheritance, identity, and even the nature of sin's entrance into the world. The debate becomes even more intense when we consider theories about Cain's own paternity. Some early Jewish traditions suggest that Cain might not have been Adam's son at all. Instead, they imply that a spiritual being, often associated with the serpent, could have played a role in his conception. These ideas, though highly controversial, have persisted for centuries, largely because of small linguistic details in the Hebrew text that seem to set Cain apart from the rest of Adam's descendants. If this is true, then the question of who Eve's first child was becomes even more mysterious. The so-called first scroll of Genesis, as some scholars refer to hypothetical lost manuscripts, could have contained details about this early period that are no longer available to us. Many apocryphal and pseudepigraphal writings mention secret traditions passed down orally before the biblical text was finalized. These writings often include details about angelic beings, early rebellions, and events that occurred before the story of Cain and Abel. If this topic intrigues you, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notifications. And tell us in the comments, have you ever heard about the possibility of another child before Cain? Your opinion is very important to us, and by doing so, you help us continue bringing deep and revealing studies like this one. Could it be that the identity of Eve's first child was deliberately hidden in these forbidden accounts, erased from the canon to prevent uncomfortable questions? The possibility of a forgotten child also connects with the broader mystery of humanity's role in a pre-existing spiritual conflict. If there was a child born before Cain, what happened to him? Did he survive, or was his life cut short? Was he part of a bloodline that was erased to pave the way for a new lineage through Seth? Such questions remind us that the biblical text, while inspired, is not exhaustive. Its silences are sometimes just as meaningful as its words, inviting us to seek the truth beyond the surface. Some ancient scholars argued that the early chapters of Genesis were intentionally concise, leaving out details that were once widely known in oral tradition. Over time, as manuscripts were copied and theological frameworks solidified, certain stories might have been deemed too controversial or inconsistent with the emerging doctrines. The identity of Eve's first child, if such a child existed, could have been one of those suppressed narratives. This possibility raises the unsettling question: how much of early human history has been lost or deliberately hidden? This theory gains traction when we consider the peculiar way Cain is described compared to Seth. While Seth is clearly presented as Adam's heir, Cain is portrayed as someone who seems disconnected from the divine blessing of inheritance. Ancient rabbis debated this point extensively, some even suggesting that Cain's very nature set him apart from the lineage that would eventually lead to Noah and Abraham. If Cain himself was not truly Adam's son, then perhaps Eve's first conception carried an even greater mystery, one that was too uncomfortable to preserve in Scripture. Another intriguing aspect is how spiritual beings are already active in Eden before humanity's story fully unfolds. The serpent is present and cunning, ready to deceive. This implies that a rebellion in the heavenly realm preceded human history. If that rebellion involved certain beings who interacted with early humanity, it could explain why some traditions speak of mixed unions and corrupted bloodlines. The story of a first child born before Cain might fit into this larger cosmic narrative of conflict between good and evil, heaven and earth. Understanding this potential hidden history also reshapes how we view God's plan of redemption. If there was indeed a child whose existence was erased, it may highlight the intentionality of God in establishing a new lineage through Seth. Humanity's story is not simply about biological descent, but about spiritual inheritance and divine purpose. This would mean that, from the very beginning, God's plan was to bring forth a people who would bear His image and fulfill His design, despite the chaos and rebellion that had already taken place. Ancient texts outside the biblical canon, such as the Book of Jubilees and some rabbinic commentaries, occasionally mention events that differ from the Genesis account we know today. These writings suggest that more happened in Eden than what is recorded in Scripture. If Eve had a child before Cain, his existence could have been tied to events that the early scribes intentionally left out, either due to their mysterious nature or because they conflicted with the theological framework being preserved at the time. This invites us to reconsider how history is shaped not only by what is told, but also by what is silenced. There is also the possibility that early manuscripts were altered or condensed to simplify humanity's origin story. Over centuries, religious leaders may have chosen a narrative that focused on Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel, and Seth to establish a clear lineage leading to Noah and Abraham. The story of an unknown child could have introduced questions that complicated the structure of biblical genealogy, threatening established doctrines about sin, inheritance, and redemption. What if that child had a role that would fundamentally shift our understanding of humanity's early history? The concept of a missing child is not just a historical curiosity, it could point to a deeper spiritual reality. Humanity's story has always been marked by conflict between divine order and rebellion. If there was a child conceived before Cain, his existence might have symbolized a breach in that order, a moment of tension between heaven and earth that was never meant to be recorded openly. This possibility helps explain why Cain himself appears as an outsider in the narrative, one whose actions quickly led to murder and separation from God's presence. Looking at the bigger picture, we see a pattern throughout Scripture. God's plans often unfold in ways that seem messy or obscured to human eyes. The silence surrounding Eve's first child, if he existed, may reflect God's decision to conceal certain truths for reasons beyond human comprehension. Yet this silence is not empty. Proverbs 25:2 tells us, "It is the glory of God to conceal a matter. To search out a matter is the glory of kings." Perhaps this mystery is an invitation for us to dig deeper, to seek understanding beyond the surface of the text. If there was indeed a forgotten child, it raises an even greater question. What became of him? Did he live long enough to establish a lineage of his own, or was his life cut short before history truly began? The absence of details in Genesis suggests that if such a child existed, his story was intentionally erased or left untold. This silence could indicate that his existence was tied to events that the biblical authors, or later editors, found too controversial or spiritually dangerous to include in the final text. This possibility connects with broader themes in Scripture about hidden truths and lost knowledge. Throughout history, God has allowed some information to remain concealed, revealed only to those who earnestly seek it. The mysterious gaps in Genesis may be one such example. Instead of a simple chronological narrative, the early chapters of Genesis could be a condensed version of far more complex events. Events that involved spiritual beings, rebellion, and possibly even a corrupted bloodline. Theories about Cain's paternity only intensify the mystery. Some ancient traditions claim that the serpent, rather than Adam, fathered Cain. While this interpretation is not part of mainstream theology, it has persisted for centuries because of subtle hints in the original Hebrew text. If Cain was already considered different, then the possibility of an earlier child, one even more mysterious, becomes more plausible. Such a revelation would completely change how we understand the first family and the origins of sin. What makes this topic so compelling is how it ties into the larger spiritual war described in Scripture. Before humanity's creation, rebellion had already taken place in heaven. The presence of the serpent in Eden shows that evil was active long before Adam and Eve fell. If a child existed before Cain, he could have been part of this larger narrative of conflict, a figure whose very existence challenged divine order. The Bible's silence, then, might not be accidental, but rather a deliberate decision to keep certain truths hidden until the proper time. When we examine other ancient sources, we find recurring patterns about hidden knowledge and suppressed history. Many cultures speak of a primordial age that ended in catastrophe, leaving behind traces of lost civilizations and forgotten bloodlines. If Eve truly had a child before Cain, his existence might have been connected to this mysterious pre-Adamic era. Perhaps he was part of a plan disrupted by rebellion, his story deliberately removed to preserve a simplified version of humanity's beginnings. This raises another question. Why would God allow such details to remain hidden? Scripture itself gives us a clue. Deuteronomy 29:29 declares, "The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things revealed belong to us." God may have chosen to veil certain truths, allowing humanity to focus on the core message of redemption rather than on details that could lead to endless speculation. Yet the fact that clues exist in ancient texts suggests that God left a trail for those willing to seek deeper understanding. If a pre-Cain child did exist, his story might reveal much about humanity's role in a larger spiritual plan. The creation of man was not simply about filling the earth, but about restoring divine order in a world that had already experienced rebellion. The erasure of this child from history could indicate that his existence was incompatible with God's plan for redemption through Adam's chosen line. This idea reinforces the biblical theme that God selects specific individuals and lineages to fulfill his purposes, even amid chaos. However, the silence of Genesis is not a void, but an invitation. The gaps in Scripture encourage us to seek God's wisdom, to ask questions, and to look for the deeper layers of his word. Throughout the Bible, we see that God rewards those who hunger for truth. The mystery of Eve's first child, whether real or symbolic, reminds us that not all knowledge is immediately accessible. Some truths require patience, humility, and a willingness to explore beyond tradition. The possibility of an erased child also sheds light on why Cain's story feels so unusual compared to the rest of Genesis. Cain's rejection, his anger, and his eventual act of murder seem to reflect a deeper tension, as if his very existence was tied to a larger conflict that began long before Adam and Eve left Eden. If there had been another child before him, one whose story was erased, Cain's life may have unfolded under the shadow of an ancient spiritual struggle that humanity inherited without even knowing it. Ancient Jewish commentaries sometimes hinted at the existence of other offspring in Eden, children not mentioned in the canonical texts. Some traditions even suggest that Adam and Eve had multiple sons and daughters, some of whom may have been conceived under unusual circumstances. These accounts, while not part of the Bible, preserve fragments of beliefs that early communities considered plausible. The consistent pattern is that humanity's earliest history might be far more complex than the brief narrative preserved in Genesis. Theories about hidden lineages and suppressed stories have always fascinated scholars and believers alike because they suggest that history is only partially recorded. Archaeological discoveries, fossils that defy the biblical timeline, and references to ancient giants in Genesis 6:4 all contribute to the idea that the pre-flood world was far more mysterious than we realize. If Eve's first child truly existed, he could represent a missing link in this forgotten history, one that would force us to rethink the origins of humanity as we know it. This line of reasoning also highlights God's sovereignty in shaping human destiny. Even if there were events and individuals erased from the written record, God's plan remained intact. From Seth onward, God established a lineage that would ultimately lead to Abraham, Israel, and eventually to Christ. The possible erasure of Eve's first child serves as a reminder that divine providence can redirect history, even when humanity's choices or spiritual rebellions seem to interfere. If this erased child truly existed, his story might be one of the greatest untold accounts of all time. It would connect the fall of spiritual beings, the corruption of early creation, and the establishment of a new divine plan for humanity. Such a possibility reinforces the idea that Genesis is not merely a historical record, but the compressed account of a much greater spiritual conflict that began long before humans walked the earth. It is a story of rebellion, judgment, and ultimately restoration. The first scroll of Genesis, as many scholars theorize, may have contained details that later disappeared from history. Whether lost through time or intentionally excluded, its absence leaves us with more questions than answers. Perhaps this scroll recorded the events of Eden in far greater detail, including the mysterious conception and birth of a child before Cain. If so, this would explain why certain ancient traditions still preserved fragments of that story, even after it vanished from the canonical text. What makes this mystery even more compelling is how it ties directly into the overarching message of the Bible. God's plan of redemption has always included the unexpected. He works through hidden details, concealed histories, and imperfect lineages to fulfill his purposes. If an erased child existed, his removal from Scripture could have been part of God's divine strategy to focus on the line that would lead to salvation through Christ. In that sense, even silence becomes part of God's sovereign plan. This realization teaches us an important lesson. We cannot assume that the Bible tells us everything in detail. Instead, it gives us what we need to know for salvation and faith. The missing pieces remind us that God remains far greater than our understanding. They also show that history, as recorded by humans, is incomplete, but God's plan never is. Every gap in the text is an invitation to trust Him, to seek Him, and to understand that His wisdom surpasses what we can comprehend. The presence of these mysteries should not weaken our faith, but instead deepen it. The very fact that there may be truths we do not fully know is a reminder of God's infinite wisdom and sovereignty. He chooses what to reveal and what to conceal for reasons that surpass human understanding. The possibility of Eve's first child is not merely an obscure theory. It points to the profound complexity of God's plan and how it unfolds across history, even through events and people we may never know by name. This perspective also explains why the Bible often rewards those who search diligently for understanding. Throughout Scripture, God invites His people to seek Him with all their heart. Proverbs 25:2 reminds us, "It is the glory of God to conceal a matter. To search out a matter is the glory of kings." The mystery surrounding a potential first child of Eve challenges us to look deeper into the Word, to connect clues scattered across different books, and to approach God with humility as we ask for greater revelation. It is also important to remember that the presence of gaps or hidden truths in Scripture does not mean the Bible is incomplete or unreliable. Instead, it shows that God's revelation operates on multiple levels. While some details remain veiled, the essential truth about God's character, His justice, and His plan of redemption is abundantly clear. The possibility of an erased child reminds us that history is much bigger than our current understanding, but God's purposes are always perfect. Ultimately, whether or not this first child existed, the lesson is the same. God's plan cannot be stopped. He chose Adam and Eve despite the rebellion that had occurred before them. He chose Seth to continue the line of promise despite the tragedy of Cain and Abel. And He chose humanity, flawed as we are, to be the carriers of His image and participants in His divine plan. Even in the face of mystery, we can rest in the assurance that God's wisdom and sovereignty remain unshaken. As we reflect on this mystery, it becomes clear that God often works in ways beyond human comprehension. The silences in Scripture are not mistakes. They are purposeful gaps that remind us of our limited knowledge and our dependence on divine revelation. The idea of a forgotten child of Eve illustrates that history may be far richer and more complex than what is written, and yet God's plan has always moved forward with perfect precision. This perspective also sheds light on why redemption was planned even before humanity's fall. Revelation 13:8 describes Christ as the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. God already knew the choices humanity would make, yet He still chose to create us and to weave His plan of salvation through our history. If there was an erased child, even that absence could have been part of a larger divine strategy that ultimately leads to the coming of the Redeemer. For believers, the greatest takeaway is not the details of a hidden child, but the assurance that God never abandons His creation. From the earliest days of the world, even amid rebellion and chaos, God has been working to restore what is broken. Just as he brought light to a formless and empty earth, he brings light into our own lives when we turn to him. His ability to rebuild and redeem surpasses anything we can imagine. Perhaps you too feel as though parts of your life are lost or erased, just like this forgotten story from the dawn of humanity. But the same God who restored a world covered in darkness is able to restore hearts, families, and destinies today. His plan has always been about redemption, even when we do not understand every detail. If this message spoke to your heart, leave your comment, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with others. Let us know where in the world you are watching from. It encourages us to keep producing more of this content for you. And that truth is more powerful than any mystery. God never abandons what he has chosen to love and restore.